Thank you so much for having me today. I'm thrilled to talk about virtual reality and the metaverse to you, and I want to thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's really special and an honor for me to give this talk. You see there the URL of my lab. That is our lab's webpage. A lot of the work we'll be talking about today is online, and you can download PDFs of our publications. You can also see our Twitter handle at Stanford VR, where when we have new findings, we release them on Stanford VR. So you can always check there to see if there's information that you find helpful. So for the next 35 minutes or so, we're going to talk about what the metaverse is. We're also going to talk about the downsides of virtual reality, because I think that's important to acknowledge that this medium, there's amazing things it can do, but it's also important to think about as we make policy, things that we should think about regulating or at least have on our awareness. Then we're going to talk about case studies in education, training, empathy and diversity, and telepresence. And I look forward to giving you this talk today. So let's start with what virtual reality is. Most people by now have tried virtual reality. They've understand that it's been used for gaming, but many people may not know that people have been using and studying VR for quite some time. So I'm a professor in the Department of Communication at Stanford, and I am also partly an engineer, and I have been building and testing virtual reality since the late 1990s. If you look on the right side of this image, you can see the headsets I was using when I first started. They are very expensive. They cost $40,000 US, and they were very uncomfortable and heavy. And there was only a couple hundred of them in the world when we started doing this work. Now, virtual reality headsets, they cost $300, and there's tens of millions of them in the United States alone. The question, now that we've got VR that's very high quality, the headsets are plentiful and they're inexpensive, is what are we supposed to do inside VR? So this is my grandfather Popper. He's 91 here, and he, like many people, put on the headset, they try virtual reality, and they say, huh, this is interesting, but really, what's the point? What am I supposed to do in here? And what we're going to talk about today are use cases that are truly worth using virtual reality for. In other words, it's a medium that is pretty intense, and we shouldn't use it for everything. So when I say we shouldn't use it for everything, to put that in context, I want to talk a little bit about things governments need to consider with virtual reality. And the first thing to think about is distraction, which is when you're wearing a headset, you can't see the real world, you can't hear the real world. So being distracted and hurting yourself because you walk into a wall, or somebody steals your wallet because you're using virtual reality on a train, is something to think about. It's a medium that's very distracting. We need to consider addiction, right? So there's a lot of literature now on how social media and video games can be addictive. There's not much work on this in virtual reality yet. However, if you think about the future, when you can have an incredible experience at the touch of a button, and every party in virtual reality is perfect, and everyone is always, they can do anything they want at any time in virtual reality, the real world can become a little less appealing. And so we need to consider, how long we're using VR and if it could possibly be addictive. There's also something called simulator sickness, which is people tend to get dizzy if they use VR for too long. Certain people in general can't use VR. So people that get very motion sick when they're in an automobile, they're more susceptible to simulator sickness in VR, and they struggle with the medium. And then we need to think about kids. So here in Silicon Valley, where Stanford is located, I've done work with Google and with Facebook to help them understand, at what age can kids use VR? And kids, what we've shown in our lab is that kids are unique. They see VR as it's quite real. Jackie Bailey, who's a professor at the University of Texas, has shown that when kids have an experience in virtual reality, for example, they meet a cartoon character, it's more persuasive to them than when they see it on TV. They're more likely to comply with a request from a character. For example, when he says, come closer to me, they're going to more likely to do it when they're in VR compared to when they're watching it on TV. And this experience stays with them longer. So it's really important to think about, virtual reality policy in terms of kids in particular, which is why I've come up with a DICE model. So the DICE model says that VR's got downsides, right? It's distracting, it could be addictive, you get a little simulator sick. So let's save virtual reality for things, if you did them in the real world, would be dangerous, impossible, counterproductive, or expensive, hence the DICE model, okay? So save VR for, if you did it in the real world, it would be dangerous. For example, training firefighters. It would be impossible, flying to Mars to learn about something. It would be counterproductive, so teaching people about climate change by showing them deforestation and actually deforesting, that would be a counterproductive way to do it. Or expensive, doing things that educationally you could never do because the cost would be so high. And I'm going to give you lots of examples of this in the next 20 minutes. So I want to start with the Stanford metaverse. When shelter in place happened in March 2020, we built a metaverse so that we could teach our students in virtual reality instead of using video conferencing like Zoom. Stanford bought us 200 headsets. We use the Oculus Quest 2 and the Pico Neo 2. And for 6 months, we had 263 students spending a lot of time together in headsets, seeing each other as avatars. In order to do this, we had to think about hardware. And so this is the stacks of the Oculus Quest 2. And you have to make a decision if you're going to implement the metaverse, which hardware are you going to use? There's pros and cons to lots of different headsets. We chose the Oculus Quest 2 because it was affordable at $299 and because it's called standalone VR. You can wear the headset without having to actually have a computer or personal computer to tether it to. It just works inside the headset. We had to think about what platform are you going to use. So if you're going to meet in VR, you've got to have all of the networking aspects of it, and all the content creation tools have to work on a platform. And there's about a dozen VR platforms, maybe more right now, and each of them have their pros and cons. We ended up choosing the Engage platform, which is an incredible platform for teaching and learning. It really supports lots of actions that teachers would take to be able to have the students facilitated in a good discussion, to be able to travel from place to place, to be able to immediately create learning content. So we chose a platform called Engage, and I highly recommend people try that. We had to think about a curriculum, so we had to flip the classroom. What that means is that I don't believe that lecturing is a good activity to do in VR. Lecturing we can do fine over Zoom, and you shouldn't have to wear a headset just to hear somebody's voice. And this is this notion of DICE, which is we're not going to just lecture in VR. We're going to come up with activities together to do. So one example is on Wednesdays during our course, we would go on a learning journey. So if the topic of this week was medical VR, how you can use VR in medicine, what we would do on this journey is we'd go together to this is a platform called AltSpace VR, and that person there in the blue sweatshirt, he is the Reverend Jeremy Nickel. He teaches meditation and paced breathing. And so you can see all of my students on their own platforms, and Jeremy begins his lesson on how to do paced breathing, and then all the platforms raise up and we're in outer space and then looking down at the earth. And what we would do is, instead of using VR for teachers telling students things, we wouldn't do that. We would do things actively together. And that's the beauty of VR, is that it's interactive and that you can go places. And so we save the lecturing for Zoom or for asynchronous reading or video watching. And when we're together in the classroom, in the virtual classroom, we do go on journeys. We would also do small group discussions in VR. And why that's important is that in Zoom, you can't figure out what someone's looking at. If somebody turns their head all the way to the left, it looks to you like they're looking at a window to the left, but that's not what they're doing. They're actually looking off the screen. And what we love about VR and the metaverse is it brings the spatial aspects back to communication. In this image, when the woman in the red sweater looks at the man in the pink shirt, he can tell that she's looking at him. And when he leans closer to her, she actually feels that personal space. And so in VR, the spatial aspect of communication is preserved. And so what you're seeing here is a small group discussion where people are together and they are perceiving properly the nonverbal behaviors of others. Consequently, you can demonstrate something called synchrony. Synchrony is what happens when conversations are flowing wonderfully. Synchrony is the secret sauce of all communication, and it's the correlation of people's nonverbal behaviors. And what we could demonstrate in this course is that people's nonverbal behaviors are correlated in VR to a way that shows that they're being very synchronous and productive. And we can actually have a quantitative measure of group performance by measuring their small group behavior, and we do show that they are synchronous. So I want to shift from the class, which was a wonderful experience and a great use of dice in the metaverse, to a second example, which is corporate training. Okay, so if you think about training, if you look at the top left of this graph, that is the ability to scale training, the ability to use it over and over again cheaply. And when you think about training, an instruction manual or 2D video is very scalable. You can make millions of copies, and all of a sudden, if you make one training instance, it scales. On the other hand, it's not that effective, right? A training manual for most things is not as good as a one-on-one expert mentor. If you look in the bottom right of this graph, that's the most effective form of training, having an expert teach you, but that doesn't scale, right? Because if there's only one expert, she can only work with one person at a time. What you're seeing in that top right of the graph is what virtual reality does. It gives you the best of both worlds, right? You have it, VR training scales because VR is just a digital experience, but it also has the feel and the effectiveness of a one-on-one expert mentor. At Stanford, we began studying VR training by training athletes. So in American football, the quarterback has got to make decisions about how to run a play. And so you can look here, the quarterback looks back and forth, and he's got to make a decision on what he should do. And so what we did with the Stanford football team is we trained quarterbacks to look around left and right, and we used virtual reality to improve their decision making by having them over and over practice looking around, see what the defense is doing, and figure out how they would behave in that instance. So to be clear, we're not teaching them how to kick or how to throw. They do that on the field. In VR, we're giving them mental rehearsal to better understand the plays on the field so that they can make better decisions when they're on the field. We worked with the Stanford team for a year, and the quarterback of the team and the coach, David Shaw, both agreed that our team had a better year than people predicted because, and one of the reasons, not all of the reasons, but one of the reasons was because of the VR training simulation. Now, when Derek Belch, who was the student who did the master's thesis with the football team, when he graduated, he formed a company. The company's called Striver, and Striver used VR for training all across sports. So we began with the National Football League, but we moved to other sports, for example, hockey and soccer or football, basketball, skiing. One of my favorite examples is the US Olympics. Our athletes, when they went to train on the mountain, every country gets 3 days. And so when we were there, in addition to practicing the runs, we filmed the run in VR. So we had a VR version of that specific run. So our Olympians came home and they got to train in VR and get the gestalt feeling of being on that specific mountain over and over and over again. It's a nice use case. But when the history of virtual reality is written, there's a moment that happens where VR training starts to really be used by millions of people. And that moment begins in Arkansas. So Arkansas is the home of Walmart, which is the largest company, Walmart. And in Arkansas, we were training the football team called the Razorbacks. And the head of training for Walmart, his name is Brock. Brock came to the football office. He put on virtual reality goggles, and he looked around and he was doing a sports demo. And he said, huh, what you're doing here is training people to look around, see and hear a very complicated scene, make a decision about what they need to do, and then tell others about that decision. That is what every Walmart associate, every Walmart employee does every day. And so we started working with Walmart, and we would do things, for example, we'd build modules on how do you have a difficult conversation with a customer who's upset with you, and you practice it in VR to get better in the real world. Or how do you prepare for the most crowded day called Black Friday, which is the day after Thanksgiving, where it's a cacophony and there's all these people around. Can you put someone in that simulation to teach them how to cope with that very stressful day? Or can you teach someone, for example, how to find mistakes in the food aisle? Is the corn stack too high? Is there not enough bags? And have them practice quickly doing a scene hunt where they can find mistakes. And it's just a great application. After a year or two of working with Walmart in a few stores, we scaled up the training so that we deployed 17,000 VR training stations across the United States. So there's about 4,700 Walmart stores in the United States, and we installed 3 or 4 VR systems in every single one of them. And this is the moment in VR's history where it's not just gamers or technologists who are using VR, but for the first time, normal people in their day-to-day lives are using VR to get better at their job. So we've got these systems deployed in the back rooms, and Walmart employees, they just go back and they train and they practice. They don't do it every day. They do it once every week or two, but it's an actual use case where people are using it throughout their daily routine, and it's just a wonderful tool. VR is a great tool for training to do things you can't do in the real world, but it's also, it saves incredible amounts of time. So this is a new tool that Walmart built. It's called the Pickup Tower. And the Pickup Tower, when new employees had to train on it, they were spending 8 hours on training how to use this machine. It's a complicated machine, and the training they did was 8 hours. And every single employee had to fly to specific stores or drive to specific stores in order to do that training. In VR, we made the training be 15 minutes instead of 8 hours, 15 minutes instead of 8 hours, and they don't have to travel, and we maintained the same level of training efficacy. So if you think about that, Walmart has 1.5 million employees. They just gained over 1.5 million work days because people no longer have to travel, and the 8 hours was condensed into 15 minutes. So training efficiency is just a great application. We started working with banks. So Bank of America was the first virtual reality scaled use in a bank. And why that's important is, in order to train people in banking, you've got to be financial technology secure. You've got to be fintech secure. And so we spent over a year doing all the measures one needs to keep data private and to actually allow virtual reality to be a banking device. Banks are using it all over the country now. We installed VR in 4,300 Bank of Americas, everything ranging from detecting fraud to improving conversational skills of people on helplines. It's just a wonderful training tool for employees. So when we write the history of VR and we say, when does VR actually start being used by regular people, corporate training is the example. I want to talk a little bit about a wonderful use case around diversity and empathy. And I'm going to show you a video here where we do something called body transfer. So this is a 20-year-old video. This is Nick Yee, the student that discovered something called the Proteus effect. So when you walk up to a mirror in VR and move your body around, you get to see the mirror image with you. So he walks close to the mirror and he turns his head and he gets to see his mirror image there. After a few minutes of doing that, the brain perceives the avatar as a self. So he was a male, and now he comes up and he's a woman. And he changed from a white male to a woman of color. He now gets to experience what it's like to have someone else's body. And then what can happen is, while wearing that body, he can have an interaction with someone else, and that other person can then treat him badly. We create simulations where you feel prejudice or bad treatment while you're wearing the avatar of someone else. It could be a different gender. It could be different skin color. It could be a different age. And what we show in 20 years of research in my lab is that this simulation where you become someone else and experience negative behavior is incredibly effective at inducing empathy and changing people's behavior, having them be more tolerant of other people. So I'll show you an example of a simulation that anyone can download for free about creating empathy towards homeless people. And in this simulation, what we wanted to do is we wanted to teach people that becoming homeless is not always about who you are. It's not always about mental illness. It's not always about you as a person. Situational factors can cause people to lose their homes, and it can happen to anyone. And so in this simulation, you got fired from your job, you're trying to make rent, so you're selling items in your apartment, but you don't do it, so you get evicted, and now you're trying to live in your car here, but the police don't let you do that, and you get arrested. Now you're trying to sleep on a bus, but this man is harassing you while you're trying to sleep. Someone else is trying to take your items. And what we demonstrate here, this is a studies by Fernanda Herrera, is that even months later, months after you've done this treatment, if you've done Becoming Homeless in VR compared to watch a video of it or do role play imagination, you are more likely to be willing to support initiatives to help the homeless. So even months later, this simulation causes pro-social behavior more than other media do. Now, I want to say very clearly here, VR is not a magic tool that solves racism and that changes perceptions of others magically. It's a tool that can help, but no media experience is going to magically solve prejudice. However, our research shows that this medium does have good effects. Okay, the final case study I want to talk about is telepresence. Okay, Hansul Jun, who actually did his undergraduate work at Seoul National, he just got his PhD with us, and Hansul has built an amazing telepresence system where in augmented reality, which is different than virtual reality. So augmented reality, you wear glasses where light from the real world can come in. So you see the real world, but you see a layer on top of it that augments it. So it's less about complete mental transportation of virtual reality and more you're just adding a digital layer to the real world. And what you can see here is Hansul has beamed another person into the room, and you get to see an avatar of someone in your own space. And it's an incredible demo. We've been studying the social interaction aspects of beaming in a hologram and how well that can work for communication. It's wonderful for what we were talking about earlier with the spatial aspect, better than a 2D video conferencing. And he has made available a telepresence system where anyone with an iPhone or with any camera that's got a 3D camera can actually beam in a hologram of someone else. So I'm going to put up a link to the app. It's a free app. It's free to the world. You can try this if you want to get a taste of what the future is going to look like in terms of having augmented reality, being able to beam in a hologram of another person. This works either using the web, or you can use any headset using an app called Web VR. So it's called Telegy. I encourage you to check it out to get a sense of what it's going to be like to beam in holograms in the future. So I wanted to thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. I went through lots of research and lots of findings over the last 30 minutes. I wanted to spend 5 minutes just talking about how governments can think about all this. I know I presented you with a lot of information. So I do a lot of work with the US government to help them start to think about this medium and, what are things that they need to be aware of. And I want to just talk about a few things that I think are important for governments to understand with virtual reality. The first is going to be privacy. So one of the things that we worked a lot with our metaverse class is how do you keep that data private? We've also accomplished that when we work with the banks at Striver. Virtual reality, there's a lot of data collected. In addition to social media where you get what people type, in virtual reality, you're getting people's body movements, right? In order to make VR work, you've got to track how they move their head and how they move their hands. And what we've studied in my lab, there's a fair amount of research on this data, we call it biometric data, we should think about it more in line with medical data. It's about your body and how your body moves. And so how do you think about privacy when, people can now, they understand how you move your body and your nonverbal tendencies, and this is a very private thing. So as you continue to think about the media of virtual reality, I want you to think about privacy. The second aspect of that is when the new headsets come out, so the Oculus Quest 2 and the Pico Neo 2, they've got something called inside-out tracking. So the virtual reality system works because there's cameras on the outside, and those cameras are actually actively scanning the world. So one thing to think about is even if you're not in virtual reality and you're around somebody wearing the headset has got cameras that are constantly filming the world around you. And currently, the privacy agreements for most virtual reality headsets, the companies own that data. So it's really something to think about. I mentioned kids earlier, and I want to flag a report that I wrote for Common Sense Media. Common Sense Media is an organization that helps parents understand media and kids. The title of the report is called VR 101, What Parents Need to Know About VR and Kids. And so I've got 2 kids of my own. People often ask me, Jeremy, how much VR do they do? The answer is that they do very little virtual reality. They've probably done it about 10 times in their entire lives, and they're 11 years old and 8. And I am a believer that VR is best done in small doses. One of the challenges of VR for parents is that you can't see what your kid is doing because they're in the headset, and the headset doesn't show automatically what's happening inside. And so there are apps, if you are parents, that allow you to mirror the screen to your phone or to a computer, and I encourage parents to download those. The final thing I will say is, in my lab, we've got what's called a 30-minute rule. If you're doing VR, after 30 minutes, we want you to take the headset off. We want you to touch a wall, talk to another human being, drink some water. And we often find that there's not much reason to go back. And I think it's important as we think about this medium that VR is not like a computer. A computer you want to use, for many hours per day. Same thing with your phone. VR is not a medium that's intended to be used in that instance. And so as you think through what one should and one shouldn't do VR from a government standpoint, I want to encourage you to think about VR in very small doses. We want to use it, not for hours a day. I don't want you to be reading your email in VR. If 5 years from now, everyone is using their headsets and they are, checking their email in their headsets, I don't think that I've done a good job here as a person that's trying to help people understand this medium. It's really good for, dice, dangerous, impossible, counterproductive, and expensive. It's not good for office work and everyday things that are better left on a computer. The final thing I will say that is in particular related to government, it's a very specific thing, but it's something I feel passionately about. There are companies that are trying to make virtual reality work while you're in an automobile. For example, a driverless car or passengers for their entertainment. I feel very strongly that people who are driving should not be in virtual reality. And so if you think about the smartphone, all of us have smartphones. And one of the things we do is we use that smartphone when we're driving, right? We talk on the phone while we're driving, and some people may glance at the phone. In the United States, it's a conservative estimate that 10 people per day are killed because drivers are texting while they're driving. 10 people a day are killed while they're driving because they feel the need to check their phone while driving. I mean, it's such a terrible thing. I'm sure that the people that invented the smartphone, if they could go back in time, they would make their smartphone not work in a moving car so that they could save at least 10 lives per day. We're at this magic point in history with virtual reality where we can stop virtual reality from causing deaths in cars. Now, you may say, I don't think any drivers would ever wear virtual reality headsets while they're driving. And I will say, we have a data point for this. There is a video game called Pokemon Go. It's an augmented reality video game where you look through an augmented reality tablet or phone to try to get these Pokemon that are in the air. And in the United States, we have many, not just a few, many documented cases of car accidents that were caused because people were looking at the Pokemon while they were driving their car. And it's a terrible thing that someone could get hurt because someone else felt the need to play a video game. So my plea to you, as you think of this medium, is how can you think ahead to saving lives because people are not using VR while they're driving their car. So on that note, I do want to not end on a completely negative note. I want to highlight all the great things VR can do for training, for education, for diversity and empathy, and for bringing us closer together when we are using telepresence systems. The key, and I'm so glad that you invited me to speak with you on this topic, is to think about saving VR for applications where you avoid the downsides we discussed, but really leverage what it's good for. DICE. Dangerous, impossible, counterproductive, and expensive. So I want to thank you again for your attention. Thank you for having me speak at this wonderful event, and good luck as you think through policy.